Welcome to Comicstorian, where you get audio dramas of your favorite comic books. Today is going to be 2023's Iron Man issues 1, 2, and 3, starting with Tony hitting rock bottom, again, and leading into how he connects to Fall of X. This is a story that Benny recorded earlier this year and has a couple of episodes in the series, so you'll be seeing that in the near future. Now let's jump on in.
Life is so much different for Tony Stark. He no longer has his company, his vast mansions, or his towers. Most of his money was spent buying dangerous weapons that he locked away in a private vault, hoping that they wouldn't get out into the world and cause harm. Now he merely has an old brownstone in New York, and a final piece of Iron Man armor. Working in his labs in the basement of the brownstone, he continues to work on the suit, but the reactor suddenly buzzes, turning red. Tony looks in shock as the entire building explodes. Sirens begin to sound as the debris rains from the sky, smoke clearing, showing the true destruction of the building. A short time later, Tony is wheeled into the back of an ambulance, blood covering his face, but he still manages to see the EMTs covering his body. One of his neighbors is dead on the scene. Later, his friends visit him in the hospital discussing what happened. He's going to be upset when he comes to, Rhodey says to Steve, but Steve shakes his head. He's awake, Rhodey. He's just playing possum, Steve Rogers says. Tony opens his eyes, looking at his friends. It wasn't an accident. A moment before the explosion, the reactor, it was corrupted, and then it phased back. It's impossible, Tony says, his voice coming out in a gasp. But before Rhodey and Riri can explain that they checked and could not find anything wrong, Tony sits up. You better hope you're both wrong. Otherwise, there's someone out there smarter than all of us. They all nod, and Riri points out that people are upset that Tony was living and conducting experiments in a residential area. Tony nods. Days later, leaving the hospital, pushing away his friends and attending the funeral of the woman who died in the explosion, promising himself that she will be avenged. He goes to his attorney, and against her wishes and counsel, orders her to pay off everyone who is suing him for the explosion. Tony, some of the people who are suing you for damages weren't even in New York City that day, Jennifer Walters states. But Tony signs the papers. Damn it, Jen! Pay them all off! He shouts at her. She raises an eyebrow at him as he sits back down, apologizing for yelling. But she shrugs. No, it's refreshing to get yelled at by a client. No one does that anymore. She says, promising that she'll deal with everything. Tony thanks her and then pauses for a moment. I couldn't find anything wrong with the reactor. Riri couldn't either. Hell, I even sucked up and asked Reed Richards. It just suddenly lost its stability. Just like me. Tony says, getting up to leave, asking her once again to take care of everything. He moves what little he owns, buying an old cab depot in Jersey City, far away from anyone. It's his retreat. He begins to work to rebuild his armor. Finally, it's done. But he needs to take it for a test flight. He heads out into the city, soaring high over New York in a matter of minutes. He swoops and dives, his onboard computer suddenly speaking up. Heads up, incoming bogey, boss tells him. Tony turns, raising an arm cannon. Stop right there! The armored being slams into him, knocking him into a nearby office building, destroying several windows and desks in the process. Tony stands as the workers all look at him in shock. You guys did just see the other guy in armor punch me in here, right? Tony asks, but they all shake their heads. I don't know. I looked up and you suddenly totaled our office, one of them says, and Tony sighs as he foresees more lawsuits. He leaps back out the window, punching into the villain. You're pissing me off, Tony says, grabbing the man by the head. If it was you who blew up my home and killed my neighbor, you should confess now while the media is here. It'll increase the odds I pull my punches and you'll survive this, Tony tells him. But the man grabs him, flinging him at a helicopter. Didn't you blow up your home? I'm just the messenger. I wouldn't concern myself with who I am. You won't be alive long enough to care, the armored foe says, and Tony spins through the air, crashing through the chopper's tail. It begins to spin through the air, going down, but Tony recovers, grabbing a hold of it. That's when the blast hits him from behind. Before this is over, and I'm en masse, you'll be dead, Stark! The foe shouts, but Tony recovers, spinning the helicopter, slamming it into the villain. He brings up an arm, firing a non-lethal round that covers the villain in goo. Stopping his armor, he sends him plummeting out of the sky. Tony gently puts the chopper down on a rooftop, and then he follows the criminal to the street below. The villain tries to raise an armored gauntlet to fire, but Tony grabs a hold of it, breaking through it. The villain doesn't even react. "You're a drone," Tony realizes, aiming his armor cannon and preparing to fire a powerful blast, wanting this fight to be over. "What are you waiting for?" the villain snaps, but something tells Tony to pause. He reaches down and he rips the face off of the drone. His eyes widen in shock as he sees a man inside, barely alive and sedated. Scans indicate the padding in the suit is actually plastic explosive. Boss reports, and Tony moves fast, pulling the man out of the suit, leaping into the air as the drone explodes beneath them. "Set a course for the nearest hospital," Tony orders Boss. Later, after leaving the man at the hospital, Tony realizes that someone is out to get him. Someone seems to be orchestrating all of this. He knows that he has to make time for AA, knowing that he can always slip back into his older life. Walking into the meeting, he accepts a cup of coffee from the table and joins the meeting, though he doesn't say anything and he just listens. After the meeting, he begins to wander. He wakes up later on the floor of a bar bathroom. Reeling, he staggers back out into the street, stumbling into the sidewalk. People begin to record him as he vomits on the street, collapsing in a pile of garbage. I need help," Tony gasps as he stares into the night sky. He blacks out and later opens his eyes to the lights shining above him. As his vision clears, he sees Ironheart hovering above him, the crowd having gathered around him, stepping back while still being recorded. "Tony, you're not who I expected to see as the #1 TikTok trend tonight," Riri says, scanning him before picking him up. "Your heart is arrhythmic, Tony. I'm getting you to a hospital," she says as they fly away, but Tony shakes his head. "No, not the hospital. Get me to the armor." She takes him to the old cab depot, and Tony pulls on his armored chest plate. "Boss, look at my heart. It can't keep a beat right now," Tony orders, and there's a chime as Boss explains that Tony has been poisoned. Deploying countermeasures. Suggested course of action, hospital admitted. Boss begins to state, but Tony orders him to shut up. Riri looks around the cab depot as Tony pulls himself into a hammock. "So this is the new home of Iron Man?" she notes, and Tony smiles. "Nobody declutters like Tony Stark," he says as she glances back at him as he closes his eyes. "You know, the world thinks that Tony Stark fell off the wagon tonight. Do you plan on correcting that story?" she asks, but he shakes his head, letting his eyes flutter close. "I don't owe the world anything. This is between me and whoever's gunning for me. I just need to sleep," Tony says quietly. Meanwhile, a shadowy figure watches the news, smiling as the current CEO of Stark Unlimited comes out for a press conference, reminding the world that Tony hasn't been affiliated with Stark Unlimited for some time. "This is too good. Much more fun than I had hoped," the man says. Meanwhile, at the press conference, the wall suddenly explodes inward and the living laser steps through it, his body glowing as he glares at the innocent members of the press. "Where is my jailer? Where is Tony Stark?" the living laser shouts. Back over at the depot, Riri is pouring a cup of coffee while Tony is watching the press conference when suddenly they both sit up as the wall explodes. "Is that the living laser?" "Yeah, and I bet they blame this on me too." Tony sighs, Riri nodding as the laser shouts for Tony Stark. "Can't imagine why!" Tony sighs, struggling out of the hammock. "Gotta suit up," he gasps. In moments, the two of them are flying across the city as Tony explains that even though he's a little goofy, the living laser shouldn't be underestimated. They track the villain outside of the former Avengers mansion where he's melting the face off of Iron Man's statue. "That's just rude, Arthur Parks. I don't have a lot of statues," Tony says as he lands in front of the villain. "You don't have any other statues," Riri points out, but Laser isn't in a joking mood. "What are you doing to me, Stark? And don't lie!" Laser shouts, and Tony doesn't know what he's talking about, throwing up a shield just as Laser fires a blast at him. The laser flies over the area, and Tony is forced to leap forward, hitting the villain. "Stop! You're gonna hurt someone!" Tony shouts at him, but Laser gets back to his feet. "You were always so smug, but I never took you as a mad scientist. But maybe all that money and power made you crazy," Laser shouts as he fires another blast that knocks Tony Stark away. "What were you after anyway? Were you hoping to add my power to your suit?" Laser asks as he stands over the downed Tony, firing a concentrated beam that cuts through Tony's mask, slicing it in half. "Arthur, stop! Use your words!" Tony says, and Laser just smiles. "Who needs words when you can use lasers?" Arthur says, Tony asking Boss what weapons he still has left at his disposal. but everything is dead. What do we have? Postmates? Can we order takeout to entice negotiations? Tony asks, and he looks up at Laser, trying to reason with him, explaining that someone is framing him, that someone is out to get him. At that moment, Ironheart is there, kneeing Laser in the stomach hard. How are your ribs, Artie? She asks as Arthur stumbles back, slicing out with another laser that cuts through her gauntlet. Okay, that's it. The gloves come off. She snaps as she pulls off the severed gauntlet. Tony struggles to his feet, staring in shock as Riri begins to glow, using the full power of the 10 rings that she recently acquired, something she promised Tony she wouldn't ever do. You will stop, she orders Laser. His arms drop to his sides as he nods. I will stop, he says, and Tony looks at Riri in surprise as she explains that she is using the Mandarin Ring's powers to hack into Laser's mind. She peers through Arthur's memories, finding that he was stunned by Tony Stark and taken away by a group of armed goons. Tony looks around in surprise as he and Riri are standing in Laser's memories. Arthur, I know you've been away for a bit, but I don't have goons, Tony says with a sigh, and Riri nods as she peers deeper, admitting that Arthur's memories haven't been tampered with at all. You're both right. Tony Stark did kidnap you and run experiments on you. Tony doesn't understand, pondering whether it could have been a life model Decoy or possibly a clone of him. The trio return to the real world and Arthur refuses to be taken in, blasting the pair of heroes one last time, leaping into the air to escape. When you find who did this, I want in, he shouts to Tony before disappearing. Tony stares after him in shock. Did he really just zap us one more time and then request a team up? Tony ponders. A little while later, Tony and Riri stand in the depot once more. While he repairs his armor, Tony explains to Riri that she should keep her distance until Tony can figure out who is after him. Do you have any idea how they poisoned you? Riri wonders. And Tony nods, explaining that it had to have been the coffee cup at the AA meeting. It's got to be about the Stark Unlimited stock price, but none of the old names fit. So many of them are dead now, Tony says. But Tony knows who he can turn to, the one man he has trusted with the most stock options in Stark Unlimited, the person that he knew would make sure to keep the company on the straight and narrow if anything were to happen to Tony. Zhang Wei is the name that Tony has always trusted for decades. And Tony knows that as long as Wei is still there, everything will be okay at Stark Unlimited. What Tony doesn't know is that elsewhere in the city, Zhang Wei is slumping in his office chair, a hole blasted through his chest. Later, Tony arrives at Wei's home to find the police carting away the body. As he stares at the body of his friend, memories of when they first met flash through his mind. Tony approached Wei to be a member of his board, to take a controlling interest in Stark Unlimited and make sure that Tony gained control of his patents, and that they wouldn't be used for ill means. Tony wanted someone who would stand up to anyone, even himself. After Wei agreed to meet that night for dinner and discuss it, Tony had to rush outside and don his armor, fighting against the likes of the Raiders, criminals who had gained control of some of Stark's tech, part of the first Armor Wars. The fight was over quickly with the help of the pre-War Machine Rhodey, but Iron Man did sorta get knocked through Wei's car. When Tony arrived at the scientist's home that night, he brought a new car with him. And what if you don't win these Armor Wars? Wei had asked. I will, Tony assured him. Why me? Wei had continued, and Tony had seen how Wei stood up to AIM before they were criminals, and needed someone with that level of ethics on the board. I need someone in my corner in this capitalist society who will choose the red ink instead of red blood, Tony said after dinner, helping Wei clean up so that his wife wouldn't have to. Finally, Wei agreed and the two shook hands. You won't regret it. Now, Tony walks outside of Wei's home to his waiting armor. Been looking for you, Tony. When I saw the news about Zhang, I came right here. I'm sorry. War Machine calls as he lands next to Tony. Tony thanks his friend, getting back into his armor. Fly with me, War Machine. I have a hunch I have to check out back in New York City. They both fly to Stark Unlimited, and Tony explains what's been happening to Rhodey and begins to cut through the glass into the CEO's office. Rhodey is shocked by everything Tony has explained. Seriously? How much trouble are you in now? Tony glances back at his friend, explaining that he even went to the graves of Obadiah Stane and Justin Hammer just to make sure they were actually dead. The pair moved through the halls of Stark Unlimited, looking for the largest labs and the most expensive projects. Under Boss's advice, Tony busts through the door of Lab 38. Shouldn't that have triggered an alarm? Rhodey asks as he follows Tony through the destroyed door. Tony glances at a nearby work desk and then to the large stasis pod at the center of the room. Yeah. Under normal circumstances, it would have. Tony steps up to the large pod. Someone abducted the living laser and made him think it was me, Tony says, and War Machine nods as he scans the pod, explaining that there are no life signs inside. Tony moves up to the pod. I need to know for sure. My guess is that this is a life model decoy of Tony Stark. Tony tells Rhodey. Suddenly the doors fly off and Tony is knocked away, slamming through the lab walls and into the hallway beyond. Like I was saying, we'd find a doppelganger armor in that pod, Tony gasps as he slams the floor. War Machine whirls, bringing up his weapons, aiming them at the doppelganger Iron Man armor. If there's anybody in that armor masking their life signs, you better step out before I crack that armor like an egg. Rhodey warns, giving the armor a second before dousing it with acid. But it steps through the liquid, firing a blast at him. Tony rushes forward, knocking the armor back with a few blows, while Rhodey grabs its arms, making sure the laser gauntlets can't hurt them. Tony rushes forward, dousing it with liquid nitrogen, freezing the armor in place, and with the fight over, the pair stare at the armor in surprise. This shouldn't have been here. The designs for this armor were conceived and fabricated outside of Stark. I've been hacked, Tony says, reaching up for the face shield, pulling it away, and both Tony and Rhodey are shocked by what they see, because the face of Tony Stark is smiling back at them. Hello, Tony. It must be so strange to hear me speak to you with your own voice. You spared so many lives by discovering this lab before I revealed it tomorrow. I'll admit, you were so slow out the gate that I was worried you'd be yet another boring disappointment, the Tony Stark life model decoy says. He turns to smile even as Tony and Rhodey are staring in surprise. I'm sorry for your friend, Mr. Zong. Suicide was always a tragic way to go. The phony Tony gloats. Tony lashes out, punching him hard, bringing the phony and armor to the ground. You murdering bastard, he was my friend! He leans over the fake Tony, demanding to know why he did this. Phony smiles. Zong's shares in the company were transferred to a charity in the days before his untimely demise. Those shares are now in play and have been sold several times. I own the company, the patents, the land. I own it all, Phony admits. Tony is shocked by this news, looking back at Rhodey. If this is someone new, you've really managed to piss them off in record time, Rhodey admits, and suddenly the armor and the decoy burst into flames. Tony stares down in disgust. Zong Wei will be avenged before this is over, Tony promises, and the decoy turns its melting face looking up at Tony. That's the spirit, Stark! When the bell rings in the morning, come out swinging. The decoy crows before suddenly and completely melting. Tony lowers his faceplate. Rhodey, I'm gonna need you to keep your distance from me for a while. I know who's behind this, and I need to start an international incident, Tony says.
And that was Iron Man issues 1, 2, and 3. I think there are at least 3 more episodes of this series that Benny had recorded, so be sure to come back in the future for more Iron Man. And please be sure to like, comment, subscribe to the channel, and share to your friends. Rest in peace, Benny. We really miss you.